Well, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome or welcome back, as the case might be. My name is Dalibor Petrovic, and I'm the host to these Tectonic Conversations. In today's session, I'm absolutely thrilled to welcome back David Shapiro. David, thank you very much for finding time to come back to our show.
Thanks for having me again.
Uh, Thank you. For those who are following, this is the episode 4 in a 6-part series where I am interviewing David and having conversations about the post-labor economics system that David has been developing and articulating in the manuscript of his book called The Great Decoupling. So, for those who are following this series, today we're going to be zooming into the chapter around measurements and KPIs. And for those of you who are joining us for the first time, you should know that we already covered the first 3 parts of the Great Decoupling, namely rise of automation that opens up the conversation around decoupling and post-labor economics. Part 2 was around decline of labor. Part 3 was all about the power balance and social contracts. And today we're going to do a deeper dive into measurements and KPIs. Following today's session, we will have 2 more sessions to wrap up the whole framework around concrete interventions, which we will do in 2 weeks on October 10th. And then we will wrap it up with what I think is going to be the most optimistic of all chapters, life after labor. So, David, with that, let's start, like we always do, with a general overview of what post-economics is and why is it important to talk about it today.
Absolutely. In a nutshell, post-labor economics is simply the natural consequence of the rise of automation in the form of robotics and AI. The fear and growing reality is that these technologies are taking more jobs than they are creating. Now, in an automated economy, that's not necessarily a bad thing because GDP goes up faster than it has in the past. However, the downside, and this is kind of the key point, the key inflection point, and we'll talk about this a lot today, is that as economic productivity goes up, and this is the entire reason the book is called The Great Decoupling, is because GDP goes up faster than household income. And household income actually might start to go down, and certainly already is going down in relation to GDP growth. Now that becomes the key nexus point. And so the entire framework of post-labor economics is about how do we ensure that household income doesn't collapse in the face of automation? Because again, the primary way that wealth is distributed and reallocated in society today is through wages and labor. But if the need for human labor goes away, then the need for wages goes away, and the entire system as it is built today kind of comes grinding to a halt. So the reason that we're talking about measurements and KPI, and the reason that that's an entire chapter of this book, is because if you don't have a measurement, if you don't have a target, you don't necessarily know what the knobs and levers that you're pulling and pushing are doing. And so you might not be optimizing for the correct target. And so that's why it bears an entire chapter and an entire conversation to talk about what do you measure and why. And then once you have that, then what do you do about it? And we'll of course talk about the interventions in 2 weeks at a much deeper level.
Yeah. What I particularly like about your work is meticulous detail in research, which is very impressive. But what is particularly valuable is exactly this, the actual concrete steps, measurements, ideas, propositions that you have that could really make a difference. What I think we all agree is that at this point in time, 2025, to me it's self-evident that we are heading on an irreversible path towards increasing automation. Just the nature of socioeconomic system is going to force that upon us. And what I believe we both share is that optimistic vision that once we are through this transition, we as a society and we as humanity could truly reach the age of abundance, where we will have enough and more for everyone to live in peace and prosperity. The challenge is this transition that we spoke about. The fact that economic growth is being decoupled from household income could result in significant socioeconomic tensions. So the applicability of the framework you're coming up with is superbly important and urgent. This is why we're having these conversations. And for those of you who are listening, please feel free to share and broadcast this message to those who you believe should be hearing these messages and help us propagate this message. Also, before we delve deeper, I would just like to mention that we are doing this live. And for those of you who are following us live, please feel free to use Q&A function of this Zoom platform to submit questions to David or myself, and I will be happy to address as many as we can. So David, today, measurements and KPIs. Of course, we have been measuring economic performance for many, many decades. Maybe we should start with you giving us a little bit of the orientation of the history of econometrics.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's of all the metrics that we have today, of course, GDP is one of the most famous ones. It's used globally, means gross domestic produce, or GNP, gross national product, as some nations prefer to call it. Now, when you have an entire nation and you want to measure, okay, what is the economy doing? The idea of a single unified economy is actually a relatively new idea. It was the, econometrics, as we understand it today, in my opinion, really kind of started with Adam Smith's book, The Wealth of Nations, which interestingly came out in 1776, the same year as the American Revolution, which is also the same year as the steam engine. So 1776 was just a really big year for the Western
It
world.
was a glitch in the matrix, I guess.
Yeah. Everything was ready to change. So, of course, Adam Smith did not introduce GDP. He did, however, start to codify the idea that, hey, we can look at a nation holistically and have a modern understanding as to what even is productivity and what is the market. Of course, there's plenty of different theories about what productivity actually means and the, theory of value of money and so on and so forth. However, generally speaking, what is considered economic orthodoxy today is now around unemployment and inflation are probably the three biggest KPI that everyone pays attention to. Now, of course, every whether it's non-governmental organizations, NGOs, or governments around the world, world banks, and so on, there's many other metrics that they pay attention to at the state level, at the county level, across different nations. But at the highest level, GDP, which basically measures all transactions in an economy. Then there's inflation, which looks at price changes of products and services over time. And then employment or unemployment is the number that we really care about. One thing that's really interesting is that, the intuition that many people would have is that the ideal unemployment is 0%.
Yeah.
That getting or that maximizing employment was actually not the most efficient way to run the economy. That you actually need a little bit of float, a little bit of unemployment to allow for more workforce flexibility, and that really what you're controlling for is not maximum employment. This is a transition that happened in the 70s and into the 80s, was rather than optimizing for maximum employment, you optimize the economy around inflation control. Because as many people who lived through it recall from history class, hyperinflation is the death of pretty much any economy, from the Weimar Republic to Venezuela and everywhere else. So the idea is that rather than optimizing, in the long run, you want GDP to go up. Every time you see, North Korea's GDP has decoupled from South Korea's GDP for decades, and now it's going down. And what is America's GDP versus China's? That's kind of a if you had to put it on the world stage, that's like the scorecard, right?
Yeah.
That's the points
The
system for
economic
the
scorecard, yeah.
yeah, the economic scorecard for geopolitics. However, within the economy, you need to measure other things, as you are measuring those things, namely things like inflation and unemployment, there's knobs and levers, and this is why it's really important. Just like if you have a fever, right? You take your temperature and you say, your temperature is 105. That's really dangerous. Let's get that fever down because that is one number that indicates a lot of else that's going on inside the body, or in the case of unemployment or inflation, that's one number that indicates that there's a lot going on inside an economy. And what that does is it tees up to have specific interventions in the same way that, if you do a blood test or your blood pressure or, temperature or whatever, medically speaking, those are all clues that say, okay, this gives us a little bit of information to diagnose the problem. But diagnosis, you don't just go to the doctor and they say, you're sick. Well, I knew that. Now what? What do I do? How do I fix it?
Yeah.
And so the job of economists is to not just diagnose a problem, which is understanding the complex system, but then also to say, okay, here's the intervention, here's the fix, here's the prescription that I'll write for you to fix this. And in some cases, some of the interventions include changing interest rates for bonds, or other very high level interventions like that, which have many, many knock on effects throughout the entire economy. If you make credit easier to access, then companies hire more, people build more houses or buy more houses. But of course, if you make credit too cheap, then you end up with an over leveraged economy like we saw in the 2008 Great Recession. So everything has to be carefully instrumented. And even then, it's not perfect because every time you feel like you understand the economy, then something changes and your previous hypothesis breaks down again, or it breaks in a new area. And this also underscores one really important point about economics broadly, whether it's fiscal policy or macroeconomics or microeconomics, is that it's all a complex adaptive system, meaning that you tighten one knob and something on the other end of the economy breaks.
Yeah.
And this happens in all complex adaptive systems, whether it's the stock market, whether it's the internet, social media, everywhere of these where you have the law of unintended consequences
Yeah.
will always bite back.
The
So that's the
butterfly effect, also known, right?
what was that?
The butterfly effect.
Yes.
The butterfly.
Butterfly effect and law of unintended consequences, or Murphy's law.
Yeah.
If it can go wrong, it will go wrong.
Yeah.
All of those apply all at once.
So you just described the three sort of main measures that have been institutionalized and accepted worldwide are the gross domestic product, so GDP, measure of inflation, and measure of unemployment or employment. You also, in your work, have done research around what other countries have attempted to measure in addition. Can you maybe just give us a couple of orientation of some of those that you came across that will be interested, that are interesting?
Yeah. So people have tried all different kinds of measurements. One example is the Gini coefficient, which
Yep.
measures inequality. There's plenty of other developmental indexes. One thing that's interesting, so whether you're looking at income inequality or, gender inequality, many of those indices, and this is one of the biggest like kind of first bottlenecks, because when I was doing my research, I said, surely someone is measuring this stuff correctly, right? But when you're looking at inequality indexes, most of the time once you get to wealthy countries or developed countries, there's not much of a difference, right? When you look at Canada or America or France or Germany, there's not a whole lot, there's not a huge difference in terms of democratic power or
Yeah.
wealth inequality. Now, obviously, well, that's not to say that wealth inequality isn't a problem, but it's not a problem that is particularly captured well compared to developed nation or developing nations or poorer nations like Nicaragua, where that's where those some of because when you have a larger disparity between some of these nations, you can say, well, what is Nicaragua doing that Somalia isn't, or vice versa? Those lessons don't necessarily apply to developed nations quite as much.
Mm.
So that was a very large gap in what I found in my research that said, well, maybe we do need to come up with some new metrics. But before I
Yeah.
got to that point, one is the famous gross national happiness in
Yeah.
Bhutan.
Yeah.
And so the idea was, I was actually watching a documentary about this just this morning. The king of Bhutan in the 1970s decided we are going to optimize this country around happiness. And so it was actually written into the constitution. Now, one thing though is that while that sounds great, this country is very, very, very slow to develop. They're very much invested in traditional ways of life, traditional clothing, traditional beliefs, and the problem is that while it is a very happy nation that is optimizing for that, young people are leaving in droves. Why? Because there's no jobs, there's no opportunity, there's no modern amenities that some of these younger people want. And so even though they're optimizing around happiness, which ostensibly is what any nation ought to, you might say, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? That's one of the bedrock of Western values. But even when you optimize it for a particular thing, it becomes Goodhart's law kicks in. So Goodhart's law says that the moment you try to optimize for something or the moment you measure something, it ceases to be a good measurement for the thing that you're trying to achieve. So you have
Yes.
all of these weird things that happen that you try and optimize for something and it has the opposite of the intended effect, or the whole system just kind of becomes lopsided. So that looking at the hit, and by the way, something that I didn't mention that in many conversations goes without saying is all of these metrics are known to have flaws. GDP, everyone knows that it's flawed. Inflation, everyone knows that it's flawed. Unemployment, everyone knows that it's flawed because the method that you use to collect these is that's one thing, but then Goodhart's law also kicks in. So there's no perfect measurement.
Yeah.
And of course, that's a very unsatisfying answer to many people that say, just tell me what to fix and tell me what to look at. But it's never that simple or never that easy, unfortunately.
And hence the need to create a new set or complementary set of measurements to keep track of what is actually happening right now in this transition into the post-labor economy. Now, so thank you very much for that. Now, the next thing that you're introducing in your theory now is this economic agency paradox that is really, I think, the core of the problem. So can you just give us a definition of what that paradox is, and let's then describe it deeper.
Yeah, so to put it in boring academic terms, the idea is that technology is deflationary, which all that means is that technology lowers the prices of goods and services. That's why we do it. That's why technology sells itself. If you didn't have electricity, you would reinvent electricity because it is so useful and it makes everything else that it touches that much cheaper and more efficient. This is why we can communicate across national boundaries instead of me recording something and then mailing you a floppy disk or a CD with my stuff on it. Then I can just email you instead. Much faster, much cheaper, much more efficient. So technology is deflationary. However, which that's ostensibly a good thing, the difference this time, though, is that artificial intelligence is not just 50% cheaper than humans or even twice as cheap or four times cheaper or 10 times. It can be 10,000 times cheaper than human labor. And that is such a market distorting force that we don't know how to price that in. And then robotics can do the same thing as that entire new branch of automation is taking up because before too long, within 2 to 5 years, we're going to have humanoid robots that cost only $1 to $3 per hour to operate, but they're as smart as Einstein and stronger than the strongest bodybuilder that's ever lived. And also they're more dexterous and can go into dangerous places. So then you say, okay, well, not only is the cognitive labor that AI is going to introduce, it's hundreds, if not thousands of times cheaper than human labor and better, but then also robots are going to come and do that to blue collar work as well. So then you have this deflationary spiral. So this is why I call it the paradox is on the one hand, the price of goods and services are going to get much cheaper. That's good for everybody, right? Your dollar goes further. However, it comes at the expense of the jobs that are lost, which means that you don't have the money to buy those goods and services anyways.
Yep.
And so then, but wait, there's more. So when we look at this from four different perspectives, it gets worse and worse the more you look at it. So first, household income. That's kind of what it all orbits around. And the reason that household income is so important is because the entire like macroeconomic theory of today is based on consumer demand.
Of course.
Now, about 55% of the economy comes from household purchases. So if you lose your job, household spending goes down. And if household spending goes down, well, then the next problem is, or if household income goes down, the next problem is your tax base shrinks. So now the government is also not happy because they're not collecting as many taxes from income and purchases. Well, then also consumer demand collapses, so the companies are not happy either. So they've kind of shot themselves in the foot by automating away all the jobs. And then the final phase of this, because every stool has four legs, or some have three, but in this case the stool has four legs. The fourth leg that falls out is banks, And then you end up with a credit crunch that is beyond anything that we've ever seen, worse than the Great Depression, because there's nothing to bootstrap the cycle again. Because back during in the days of the Great Depression in the late 1920s and 1930s, the idea was, okay, we can spend our way out of it, we can use innovation, we can get jobs back, but that's not the future here. The future here is fewer jobs over time. So there's no rebooting this cycle unless something really dramatically structurally changes. So that overall is the economic agency paradox, which is technology sells itself, as you said at the beginning. That's the market is driving that way. The socioeconomic engine is driving that way. We want automation, but it's going to come at the cost that the current system, the current complex adaptive system, will fall apart if we get what we're wishing for. So, again, be careful what you wish for.
So what we are projecting, therefore, is that over time, there's going to be lower and lower percentage of wage drawn income as part of the household income. And unless we make some changes, that is going to draw us into a socioeconomic collapse, right? That's what we are dealing with here. And now the question is, how much time do we have for these interventions? And this is, I think, ongoing debate. Some people are saying that this is going to unfold in the next few years. Some people are saying this will take a couple of decades. But I think nobody's questioning that this is the trajectory. Now, can we stay for a second on this topic and describe the three categories of household income and have that discussion? Because I think this discussion actually hides the answer, right?
Yes. Yeah. So when I came to this realization, I said, okay, it all hinges around household income and the collapse, the potential collapse of household income. So then my next logical question was, well, how do you break down household income? Because I was thinking, there's wages, but not everyone works, or, some people are capitalists and they get money from investments and other things. And then how does welfare figure into all that? So I looked into it, and it turns out the government, at least many governments, already track this. And in America, the BEA tracks it very, very straightforwardly, and it breaks household income down into three overarching buckets. Now, each of these buckets is subdivided, but the three highest categories of household income are: number one, wages, which is, a paycheck that you get.
Yep.
Number two is capital. So that is rental income, that is stocks and bonds, or businesses that you own. So that's category number two. And then category number three is transfers, which is stuff from the government,
Government
whether it is
transfers, yeah.
welfare or Medicaid or retirement, whatever. All household income fits into one of those three buckets. Now, again, there's subdivisions, but I said, okay, those are three kind of food groups. Now, what's the ratio? And we'll get into that in a minute, but that was kind of an eye-opening direction. I said, okay, now we're starting to really, have the rubber meet the road here.
Mm-hmm. So three big buckets, food groups or categories, as you call them, food groups. I love that. And in the current moment in North America, and maybe this actually applies across the Western world at the moment, the distribution of those is about 60% of average household income comes from wages. About 20% comes from what you call capital or some form of property rights, right? Rents and so forth. And about 20% on average comes from government transfers. That's the
Correct.
current situation.
At a national level.
At the
It
national,
varies. In here in America, in Appalachia, which is the East Coast mountains, some of the poorest states and counties are there, and it can be up to 30 to 35% transfers, and roughly the same wages and almost no property-based income, versus richer counties in New York or Texas or California can have a much higher disproportionate income from property. Why? Because they have, their tech bond, their tech stocks and those sorts of things that come
Mm,
in. And it also varies by nation. So, for instance, nations with heavier social programs like Germany, it might be closer to 30% on average come from transfers. So I just wanted to add a little bit of color to those
yeah,
numbers. These
yeah,
are not exact numbers, but it does vary.
yeah. And I know that in your book you are providing all of these examples and fluctuations and variations, including calling out the specific counties in the United States and their differences. But here's where we're at now. So let's say that on average, at the moment, North America, 60, 20, 20. We just spent the last 5 minutes describing how and why the labor proportion is under attack, and it looks like the 60% is going to be declining over time.
Yep.
So what do? We have we have these two other pillars that we need to either light up or invent a fourth pillar, but that really is the math that we are now dealing with.
Right.
And at that point, you have introduced the concept of the economic agency index as a way to actually track this and help point to what interventions might be needed. Can you just describe to us what these new measurements you are proposing actually are, and then we'll go deeper into those.
Yeah, absolutely. So once I figured out that household income breaks down into these three buckets, wages, capital, transfers, I said, okay, well, what are we trying to change for the future? And if wages are going down, and that's kind of what we want, in an automated economy, if we want to get to fully automated luxury space communism, that means that you ought, by definition, you automate away labor and the need for human labor.
Yep.
So then that leaves two remaining buckets, and that is transfers, which is UBI, by the way. UBI would be an example of a kind of transfer,
Yeah.
or capital-based income, which is more market-oriented. And I said, okay, well, some people want UBI, right? Some people want to, just government, just tax and give me money back. Now, that can be helpful because it's universal and it's automatic and it's bureaucratic, and if you've got a good government, then it's transparent, but you don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, and you
Yeah.
also don't want to destroy the market. So then I said, well, the capital. So then the question becomes, okay, well, if we want households to get more of their income from capital sources, which is stocks, bonds, rental properties, businesses, and so on, that's what we're optimizing for. So I said, well, why don't we just measure that? Why don't we
Mm.
actually just create a metric around this? And thus was born the Economic Agency Index, which takes those ratio of those three buckets, wages to capital to transfers, and it weights them. And so what you do is you don't change the way that wages are weighted. Those are weighted neutrally because if you can get money from wages, you don't want to punish that in this measurement.
Yeah.
But what you do is you negatively bias transfers because you don't want to rely on transfers if at all possible. Now, that's not to say that the optimal amount of transfers is zero. It's probably somewhere between 10 and 20, or sorry, somewhere between 10 and 30%, somewhere. That's up to debate, and we'll find that out as we go. But what you really want to bias this towards is you want to positively weight capital. So that
Yeah.
means that when you create this index, let's just, and in the book I have some examples. A typical run-of-the-mill county in America right now, probably around an index of zero point 0.6 or zero point 0.5. But ideally, you get that up to zero point 0.8 or zero point 0.9 or even all the way to 1, which would mean that the vast majority of its income is coming, or of household income is coming from capital. Now you
Mm.
might say, okay, that sounds great, but how do you get there? And we'll get to the interventions later, but first you have to know that what you're measuring. Just
Yeah.
in the same way that if your blood pressure is too high or too low, it speaks to an entirely different pathology. So we're still working on how do you diagnose the pathology right now. So then when you look at poorer counties or poorer nations or poorer states, that you see, well, if they rely heavily on transfers, their agency index might be zero point
Lower.
0.3, which is really low. So then what this allows us to do is look at different counties and say, okay, if you have a county that's at, and by the way, the reason that I break it down into counties is because that's the most granular data that we have at a national level in America. Which means that you can compare one county to the next and say, what is this county doing differently that this one isn't? Why is this one struggling where this one is doing a little bit better? And you
And
can
there
look at
is and there
all
is
kinds of
3,000 of
policies.
them. And there are
Right.
3,000 of them, right? 3,300 counties, I think,
Yep.
which makes it such a statistically relevant grouping where you can actually measure in real time different levers being pulled, right?
Exactly. Exactly. Now, In many cases, it's very obvious, right? Once you measure this and create a dashboard, you say, oh, well, I know that Mecklenburg County in North Carolina, because that's where Charlotte is, that one is doing okay because that's the banking capital of the South. And in other cases, you say, well, I know that this county is really poor because their mine closed. But when you have 3,000 natural experiments running side by side, you can look at counties that are more similar to each other. And you
Mm,
say, okay, some of the things that you might find is, wait, this county did an arts collective. Why did that have such a big impact? And it's because they have these knock-on effects, these butterfly effects. So,
mhm.
for instance, if you build an arts collective or have policies that include arts and cultures in a county, that attracts more residents, that attracts more investors, and it raises the entire county. It's not something that you'd expect to see. And that's the kind of thing that it's not even necessarily a super expensive intervention. And another thing is it's not directly a financial intervention. So this is one of the things that I found in implementing this economic agency index that just by virtue of creating a heat map where you can compare counties, what's the first thing everyone does is they go look at their county and see how it stacks up against other counties. And so again, once you have the right measurements, a lot of it, especially when you start doing these comparative analyses, a lot of ideas start percolating out and falling out very quickly. And that another reason that I think that measurements are a superpower is because then it empowers everyone else. It's not just me coming up with ideas anymore. You go do your own experiments, go do your
Sure.
own hypotheses and test those results.
This is excellent. So economic. So I want to just make one important point here because you actually mentioned the word space communism. Economic Agency Index is intended to track and help us actually extract ourselves from human labor and reposition average household income such that majority actually comes from capital. So therefore, this would be an economic index that would continue tracking and measuring how successful we are in refactoring capitalism in which we live, appreciating that it might not be working anymore the way it has been, and that we need to have some form of change and refactoring of the system itself. And this economic agency is going to be helpful to keep us track of that progress and see the rebalance. Why I'm mentioning this? Because effectively, and we just talked about this before we went live, David, the highest in your view of the economic agency index, the highest ratio of that index arrives when the maximum, when the highest source of family income comes from capital or property. So
Correct.
this is very important. What I want to mention is because when we talk about substituting labor and we talk about universal basic income and government transfers, critics of this could start calling this, oh, you are introducing socialism, communism. We are not. What we are saying is that we need mix of interventions, and now we have an idea of how we could measure them. So that's one thing. Second thing, if you don't mind me just saying this, economic agency index, very useful as a measure for the counties, but it's also useful as a reflection of your personal family income. And as we are thinking about how do we navigate our personal lives and our families and our own financial well-being and our own economic agency, I think everyone should be starting thinking from this perspective too. Do the
Oh yeah.
calculation for your family, for your personal situation. How much of your monthly income comes from passive sources of income versus active? And what can you personally do to make the shift right now in the way you organize your own finances, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So now, David, you brought two very powerful measures, new measures into the conversation. We just covered one. We're now going to cover the second one. The second one that you introduce is called the inclusive capital income ratio. So let's give us the context of that one.
Yeah. So, as with any measurement, as I talked about at the beginning, once you have a target, it ceases to be a good target on its own. And also there are flaws with any methodology is going to present, some caveats and some blind spots and that sort of thing. And when you look at the economic agency index, you say, okay, well, could this be gamed? Right? Or you could say, but things need to be a certain way, or are you sure that you really want to punish or not weight wages? Or, what if, capital based income, does that include sovereign wealth funds? Or is that mostly just personal property? Those kinds of things. And so then I said, well, what's a simpler way of doing this?
Mhm.
And also, the first time you tell people that, 20% of household income comes from capital, a lot of people say, mine doesn't. What are you
Yeah,
talking about? And,
yeah,
and that is because on average, 20% of household income comes from capital, but that is heavily weighted towards the wealthy, the
hmm,
business owners and the stockbrokers and the billionaires and the millionaires and the people who most of their income does actually come from
yeah,
capital. Jeff Bezos, he's 100% capital based income. But so that kind of skews it when you're looking at aggregates. So I wanted to come up with a way to say what actually captures middle America. And
mm,
so that is where I came up with the inclusive capital income ratio, which is a mouthful, ICIR. It's easier if you write it out, ICIR. Um, so this was okay. Well, how can we overcome some of those flaws? That because the aggregate is one thing, even if you break it down to the county level, it's still you're going to have some wealthy people in a county that can really skew that. So the ICAR is very, very simply defined. You take the median household and you base it on how much inclusive capital is based, how much of their income is based on inclusive capital versus everything else. And it's brain dead simple. You might say, okay, well, what does inclusive capital mean? So
mhm,
inclusive capital means money that they get that is from inclusive sources, such as sovereign wealth funds or urban wealth funds, those kinds of sources. Now, that will never get to 100%, but it is a very simple percentage. And right now, when I've run this metric against some counties, it's basically like around somewhere between 2 and 6% globally. So it's a very, very low number, meaning that uh, almost no money is exchanged hands globally, and no matter what level you zoom it at, is coming from inclusive sources of capital, which is things like cooperatives, collectives, trusts, sovereign wealth funds, all of those things. So those are resources that are held in common.
yeah. The
So this
Commonwealth,
measurement, yeah,
the
exactly.
actual, not Commonwealth, but the actual Commonwealth, as
Right.
yeah,
Yep. And so the idea here was to create another measurement that would look at the same problem, which is how are households getting money, but from a different angle. So you got, one from the top and one from the side or front and
yeah,
back,
yeah,
so on and so forth. And what this does is it allows not companies, countries to say, okay, well, we want to turn that knob up. We want to get households to the point where maybe a majority of their income, certainly more than 6% of their income, is coming from these collectively owned assets.
yes,
So that way you know that every household has a stake in the game. Now, one of the examples that I was actually after I wrote the previous draft of this book that came out was baby bonds. So I think it was Illinois was the first state to do this, but now $1,500 of a stock market indexed bond is going to be assigned to that child at birth. That would be an example of inclusive capital. So while the term inclusive capital might sound outlandish or alien or like socialism or Marxism, it's something that's being piloted by the Trump administration, which you don't typically
yeah.
up with. It's just a term for a type of investment that states and nations can make. And the idea is to increase that over time.
And and that would be different category from universal basic income, which you would consider to be part of government transfers.
Correct.
Right.
Yeah. So to clarify, it might say, but if the money is coming from the government, what's the difference? So for it to be a transfer is paid for by either taxes or by printing money. Now, states and cities can't print money.
Yeah.
All they can do is do taxes. And also, many nations can't even print money. America has the privilege of being able to print
Correct.
money, but many other nations use reserve currency that they can't print. But a transfer is you tax one place or tax a group and spend it elsewhere. So that's a transfer. But capital or property is a different category. In some cases, it's a natural resource.
Yeah.
So the Alaska Permanent Fund is an example where Alaska treats the oil that they pump out of the ground as a collective good,
Yeah.
and so then you get some remuneration from the state having licensed out those wells. There's other examples. You can have just a wealth fund that is not based on a natural resource. It can be based on stocks and bonds, and
Yeah.
basically your country can run its own hedge fund.
Yeah. So in other words, so that this is that new category that is currently under leveraged. Some examples exist worldwide where this has really taken off and is truly working very successfully. Norwegian pension fund, right? The Norway fund is now, I think the estimate is $1.6 trillion dollars, and that fund funds Norway's public services, and that's the idea, right? So how do we light up the wealth of resources and the wealth of nation and find a way to convert that into actual equity ownership that will pay dividends to individuals and families regularly, making a increasing percentile of their family income to supplement the decrease that we're expecting from labor, right?
Yep. Yeah, and to that end, here's another example of something that would be inclusive capital that is so far outside of most people's consciousness that even I had a hard time wrapping my head around it at first. And this is the example of spectrum. So spectrum is airwaves, right? Radio waves through the air, whether it's data or audio, video, radios or television. Right now, that is all licensed, but nobody really rents it, right? However, the idea of this is instead of allowing people to, once they have some spectrum carved out, that's just theirs to use without paying for it, it's a common good. So that common good should be paid for. So that is one example of something that would be inclusive capital, meaning, if a broadcast company is dominating a certain frequency bandwidth, they pay for that. And that goes to the people who own it in collective, which is the residents or the citizens whose bandwidth they're taking.
Yeah.
Another example is carbon. So carbon taxes are already being used as a way of dissuading, heavy pollution. But right now, that technically just goes back to the government, and we're not really sure how it's spent or if it's spent well. So we can overhaul the transparency there. Or those carbon taxes could go directly to households. And
Yeah.
that is, again, in exchange for polluting the environment that the citizens of a nation own, you say, okay, we're going to give you some money in exchange for the harm that we've done, which everyone wins from that because you get money directly from these companies. And then also they're discouraged from harming the environment. So those are two examples of inclusive capital that are not necessarily just like a company or a resource.
Yeah, and as I mentioned earlier in this conversation, what I really find compelling in your work is that you've done such a detailed, meticulous research and identified real cases where real interventions are being made and are producing results. So I'm really looking forward to our next conversation where we're going to delve deeper into all of those interventions. David, couple of questions that came from the audience.
Froze.
So,
Oh, there you are. Okay.
is that okay?
Yeah, it just froze for a few seconds.
Sorry, yeah. So I was just mentioning a couple of questions that maybe we can address. So Ken
Sure.
is asking, do you think we can use a new monetary system to help humanity transition to post-labor economics? How would you interpret that question?
There. One of the most notably, Iman Mostak right now is creating a theory, what he calls the intelligent internet and the last economy, where he's proposing that one of the best ways to solve this problem might be creating an entirely new monetary system. So here's the basics of how it works. Now, what I want to do is I want to preface this by saying I don't agree that this is necessarily the direction to go, but it's an interesting theory. Right now, the Fed, the central banks, print money, and they print money and they hand it out, and then that money circulates through the economy, and then when you pay back the Fed with interest, then that money is destroyed. So you have this hydrological cycle, right, where you have money injected and then money removed. So one of the premises from Emad's theory is that instead of money being printed at the top and injected from the top down like a shower, it
Mhm.
should be injected at the bottom, meaning that people, individuals, citizens are the ones who print money effectively using cryptocurrency.
Mhm.
So then the idea, and this is something that I don't think he has addressed in his theory, is that if you do that, then you have a lot more inflation than you have today because you don't have a way of taking that money out of circulation. So the idea then would be you'd have to have either people print money and then people destroy money, so they take the role of the central bank, which I'm not sure how that would work, or you have something collecting the money at the top, maybe the government when they, part of the taxes that they take is just destroyed. So I want to point out that like this is a possibility, but it would completely flip the entire economic orthodoxy on its head, and I don't think it has been trialed anywhere. So I would be very cautious about implementing something like this. Anything other than experimentally in small scales, not until it has been thoroughly simulated in virtual environments and modeled and tested to make sure that it would work. So with that being said, I personally don't think that that's the correct direction to go. Now, of course, with cryptocurrency, you do have the technological capability for people to mint their own currency. But when you look at places like Solana, where more than 90% of every coin minted is a scam, it doesn't really, to me,
Mhm.
feel like that's the safest direction to go because then you're just having people what stops people from just minting their own money at all times and manipulating the system.
Yeah.
So yes, those theories are out there. They look like they're to me they look like they would introduce more instability than we could tolerate right now.
Yeah.
Will we eventually get to something like that? It's not outside the realm of possibility, but certainly for the transition that we have to go through over the next decade or two, that feels a little too revolutionary for me.
Excellent. Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I have a fellow Canadian submitting another comment or a question. Ken, by the way, Ken is the leader of the UBI Works. So thank you, Ken, for submitting this question. Um, he said he loves the idea of the Economic Agency Index. What is your thought about its susceptibility to the Goodhart's law?
Yeah, so any measurement is going to have its own flaws and weaknesses, and this is one of the things that lots of people have pointed out is that let's say just for instance, let's imagine a future scenario where I'm in the state of North Carolina, and let's say that North Carolina implements some of these policies, and their policies reward counties for increasing their economic agency index, or they hand out more help, more aid for a lower economic agency index score. That immediately gamifies the score.
Hmm.
And so then it's like, well, if I want to get, more education funding, I need to raise my EAI. So what's the quickest way I can game that? Is there a way that I can change my reporting or a way that I can technically make it look like my economic agency index is going up so that I can get some more, benefits or perks or rewards? Or can I game it down so that I can get more handouts?
Hmm.
So absolutely any measurement, it's the same problem with giving grades to children, right? You teach to the test, so that what teachers want is teachers and school systems get rewarded based on their
Scores?
graded
Yeah.
grades and their test scores. So well, they gamify even the way that they teach. Likewise, the absolutely the same thing could happen if economic agency index was deployed broadly. In the intermediate term, it has a lot of value right now because there's already differences and people haven't been optimizing for it. So I will agree that with the implication that economic agency is the most valuable right now because it is not being optimized for yet. With that being said, if we don't try and optimize for it with specific policies, like for instance, if at the state or federal level, if we do not say, hey, we're going to have rewards based programs based on economic agency scores, we're just going to measure that and use it as a comparison for studies, like from a scientific standpoint,
Yeah. Yeah.
that could be better rather than from a policy standpoint. So it's more how you use it rather than what the measurement is actually measuring on its own. So
This was
yes, it is a risk.
fantastic. David, thank you so much. This was really exceptional. So what we've covered today in our part four episode 4 of our six-part series. We spoke about measurements and KPIs. We established that existing measurements are flawed and are not going to be useful to us as we navigate this transition into post-labor economics, that we are dealing with a fundamental decoupling between GDP and labor, human labor workforce, and that this is going to very likely result in this paradox where the overall economy looks like it's growing while individual households are having harder and harder time bringing income into their homes, and that this paradox needs to be understood and addressed, and that the way to think about it is to unpack how families bring income into their households with work and capital and government transfers, and recognize the need to measure how is this unfolding, and these measurements provide us guidelines on what levers to pull, because I think we are agreeing that this shrinkage here is unavoidable. We are not anymore able to control this. We can only
Right.
control how do we now rebalance, right? And so we spend time discussing the two specific measures you're introducing: economic agency index that tracks the balance between these food groups of family income, and then the inclusive capital income ratio, which tracks how much of your household income comes from this under maybe under leveraged so far category of common wealth, and your participation as owner of this common wealth that you get because of the privilege that you were born in a functioning society that generates wealth, right? Private from so this is what we call. And I want to thank you very much for this, David. We are going to publish this today on YouTube, both on Tectonic Conversations and of course on your channel as well. And for those who are interested to carry on listening to us, please register for the session in 2 weeks, where we are going to unpack the actual interventions and ideas on how to solve for this. The link will be provided right below in the YouTube comments. So with that, David, thank you so much. Have a lovely weekend, and I look forward to our next episode.
Thank you so much for everything. Take care, everybody.
Bye bye.